Thank you, everybody, for coming to the Aaron Torres Podcast YouTube page. If you could do me a quick favor, see that little subscribe button at the bottom of your screen? Go ahead, click that subscribe button. Really does help our channel grow, our audience grow, and I really do appreciate it more than you know. So click that subscribe button. Appreciate your support. Now, here's the video that you came here for. So this question actually did not come from Twitter. Came from a listener of the show who's also a buddy of mine, who also happens to be in a pretty in-depth UConn text chat with me. My buddy Dustin in Connecticut. Shout out Dustin. He tweets, or he texted me, really. He also has tweeted me many, many times. But he texted me, Aaron, any news on Karaban? And so Karaban, of course, is Alex Karaban. He is the fifth starter from the UConn National Championship team this year, and he is going through the NBA draft process. When I say fifth starter, what I mean is that essentially the first four starters are in the NBA draft to stay. Tristan Newton and Cam Spencer are out of eligibility. Donovan Clingan and Steph Castle are going pro. And so Alex Karaban is testing the draft waters. Dustin wants to know if there's any update. And what I think this will be a good thing to do, we'll get to Alex Karaban in a minute, but I think right now it would be a good time to just kind of reset the NBA draft deadline and really dive into, okay, who is still in the NBA draft, who could come back, and what would it mean for college hoops in 2024, 2025? Now, what I find interesting about this year is that it really does feel like there are less big names that seem to be on the stay or go fence in terms of the NBA draft. Just feels like in years past, I mean, we'd have a dozen, 15, whatever players deciding at the last minute. And I think this year, because of NIL, there's just a lot of players that like, look, if you're a first round pick, you're going to go, you're going to stay in, you're going to go pro. But if you're on that cusp, it feels like most of these guys are saying, I'm just going to come back to college. I'm not going to worry about it. I'll come back for another year. Frankly, I'm going to get paid not only better than I would as a second round or undrafted guy, but in many cases, I might actually get paid significantly better by being a college basketball player in 2024, 2025, as opposed to going pro. And so what we have seen, and what I just find fascinating, is the group of players that is in the NBA draft is frankly just not as many as you would think in terms of players that are trying to decide if they want to stay or go, return to college basketball or not. And so let's get into some of the big names. Let's start with Alex Karaban, 6'8" forward. And what's interesting about him is he is a player that not only has a tough decision, but he is one of the few players that not only has a tough decision, but that decision has been made harder over the last couple weeks. When the season ended, Alex Karaban, very interesting situation. UConn Victory National Championship Parade is asked about the possibility of returning to college basketball in 2024, 2025. And he essentially says, I'm probably coming back. I'm going to test the waters, but if I'm not a guaranteed first round pick, I will be back. I'm a year away from getting my degree. And oh, by the way, he said something about, I want a three-peat. So that got Torres all tingly when I heard that. But he said it. But what's also interesting is that for a player like this, as you have more success and as you get further away from being on campus around your teammates, I think it makes it less likely as you continue to have success that he comes back. Well, he's a guy, he went to the NBA draft combine. First off, the measurements were pretty good. 6'7" or so, little under 6'7" without shoes, but a 6'11" wingspan. And at 6'7"-ish, 6'8", 8.5 with sneakers, he was the best three-point shooter in that three-point shooting event that they have there. I think it was 21 of his first 25 he hit, or something like that. I think it was 21 in a row, something like that, whatever. And so when I look at Alex Karaban, I'm going to be perfectly blunt. It is a situation that when I look at him, when I look at what he has done, I do kind of lean towards the possibility that he is going to, in fact, stay pro. Now, a couple things. He has not earned his degree. So if he comes back next year, he is on pace to do it. But he also said in a recent interview, I think it was at the NBA Draft Combine, that he plans on taking it right up until the deadline. So again, the NBA draft deadline is this coming Wednesday, May 29th. Probably not totally fair to those kids. We'll talk about it a little bit later with Coleman Hawkins. But if I had to lean right now, I would say that Alex Karaban is probably going pro. UConn loses all 5 starters. And oh, by the way, it will be as much of a rebuild as you can have coming off back-to-back national championships. In terms of some other players that you kind of need to know in terms of the NBA draft deadline, one that's interesting to me, Caleb Love. Caleb Love, we all know his story, 4 years at North Carolina, has ups and downs, peaks and valleys there, transfers to Arizona. And I'll say this, I thought he had a pretty good year in terms of who he is, what he did, and really basically I thought it was just a good year for him in terms of kind of refinding himself, rediscovering his brand. And also, I think Arizona really benefited from having him. They in the previous years, there have been years where did you have a guy that wanted the ball late that could take over games late? Well, Caleb Love is not afraid, had a great year, 18 points per game this season at Arizona. In terms of his NBA future, he's one, I actually think it's the opposite of Karaban. I think it's almost certain that he comes back at this point. Listen, I think he's going through the process to meet with teams, get in front of teams, get as much basically information out there, because at some point next year, he is going to be an NBA prospect and he is not going to have college to come back to. But my hunch, and really it's beyond a hunch at this point, I'm almost certain he's coming back. If he does, it's obviously a huge, huge, huge thing for Arizona. KJ Lewis, their freshman guard who was off the bench like a 7th man this year, he announced last week he's coming back. And with Caleb Love and KJ Lewis back, I believe that is a top 10 team going into next year. Now, the interesting thing is, remember, they're going to the Big 12 next year. So, yeah, they're in the top 10, but so is Baylor, so is Iowa State, so is Kansas, so is Houston, etc. But Caleb Love, I believe, will return. I think an interesting side note on that is that if he returns, I also do expect there to be some roster movement. It won't be all positive. A name to keep an eye on, Josan Sanan, a 5-star reclassification kid. He committed about probably 8 weeks or so ago. I've been told that basically he's already kind of preparing to decommit. I think I know where he's going to go if he ends up decommitting. But Josan Sanan, I believe, will not be an Arizona Wildcat if in fact Caleb Love removes his name from the draft, which I expect him to. A couple other names, and these are some that are familiar. I think we've talked about them quite a bit here over the last couple weeks. First one's from Alabama, Mark Sears and Jaron Stevenson. So my opinions on Alabama have been pretty clear. I believe if Mark Sears and Jaron Stevenson come back, Alabama is your number 1 team in the country. Kansas, you can certainly make an argument for, but Alabama is going to be 13 deep with really good players who can all play. But Mark Sears is kind of the straw that stirs the drink. 21.5 points per game, 44% shooting from 3. And I know I've said it a million times, but being around UConn at the Final Four, they were as impressed with Mark Sears and what he was able to do against that elite defense as anyone they played all year. They were blown away talking to those guys in the locker room after the game about how good he was and his ability to put the ball in the basket. Now, it's a little bit of a disappointing thing from his perspective. Went to the NBA draft combine, got a little bit banged up. I think it was maybe an ankle. Was able to play, but did not play well. I expect him back. Jaron Stevenson, 19 points in that Elite 8 win over Clemson. I expect him back as well. I think Nate Oates, about maybe a week or so ago, he was on one of those speaking tours where you kind of go on the booster club circuit, you talk to different boosters, and you get everybody hyped up for the season. I believe he referenced Cliff Omoruyi. Every time I try to say his name, I say it differently. Cliff Omoruyi, excuse me. Every time I say his name, I say it different. I believe he referenced Cliff Omoruyi as Alabama's 13th man, meaning they expect to have all 13 scholarships filled. So because of it, I think that Mark Sears will likely be back at Alabama. Couple other names really quickly. One, there is Walter Clayton, who was Florida's leading scorer this year. He's kind of one that's kind of fallen through the cracks. transferred from Iona to Florida, chose Florida over St. John's last year, of course, with Rick Pitino, was a star in the SEC. He has entered the NBA draft. I expect him to withdraw his name if he were not to. Crippling news for Florida. If he does remove his name, I think Florida's a top 20 team coming into next year. And it's worth noting, there are a lot of guys that we've talked about that are also in the portal right now that have not made decisions. Coleman Hawkins, who we've talked about and who we will talk about going forward. Coleman Hawkins, Jackson Robinson, all those guys that we've talked about nonstop. Also, a couple players who have committed to schools in the portal that aren't quite out yet. Lamont Butler at Kentucky is not officially withdrawn. He will, though. I'm actually told that he'll probably visit Kentucky sometime in early June. Remember, he committed sight unseen about a month ago. And John L. Davis from Arkansas, remember, he has not officially withdrawn yet, although I would expect him to. But those are the big names in the NBA draft process that you definitely need to know.